The world is in short supply of kings. I mean that relatively speaking, of course. You will remember that earlier this year, Britain crowned King Charles III, making him one of only 29 monarchs around the world. And of those 29 monarchs, only 7 of them rule with absolute governing authority, absolute power. In fact, 13 of those 29 monarchs have no governing authority whatsoever. You can compare that with the numbers around the early 1900s when there was nearly 160 monarchies around the world. And we can see that the world has generally tried to move away from kings. No country has done so more famously than our own country, America. We cast off a king. We have been a country with no king for our existence. In this country, the United States, you are most likely to run into a king in one of 2 places. You will run into kings in history museums or on TikTok. Burgers too. Good point. That's why he's the rector. He knows where the 3rd kings are. I'm going to share with you a little bit of internet slang. The internet culture has done something interesting with the word king. This is why you let me preach 6 times a year, right? It's so I can teach the congregation the slang of the youth today. The internet culture has taken the word king and they've transformed it into an adjective to talk about to celebrate somebody, like a trait that traditionally maybe would be seen as negative, but to celebrate it as a positive. And I'll give you an example of this. To a diminutive gentleman, you might say he's a short king, right? To celebrate our short kings. Or to a taller lady, you might say she's a tall queen, right? Take a thing that people might view as negative. You celebrate it as positive. Turns out, though, that just because you've been named a short king does not give you any governing authority. Like 45% of the monarchs in the world today, you have no special power over other diminutive gentlemen. Now, of course, you now know this knowledge, each and every one of you. And so as a gift this morning for being at church, you have the ability to make your children and your grandchildren just cringe at will. So use that power responsibly. But I digress. Clearly, there are lots of kings in the world. Maybe some of you know some royalty. Maybe some of you are some royalty. This morning, I will tell you are in the presence of royalty. I am, in fact, 2002 Klein Oak High School homecoming king. Maybe there are some other members of the homecoming court, a prom king or queen here in the audience. It's not a thing I talk about a lot because I'm almost 40. It'd be sad if I brought that up. But for today's purposes, come to find out, homecoming king, yet another title with no real authority. I was going to remake that high school. They would not let me. I go on and on about kings like this because today is Christ the King. On the last Sunday of the liturgical year, of the church year, we celebrate and recognize Jesus' kingship. It is a subversive thing for us to gather together each week and proclaim Christ as King. It's possible, I admit, that in 2023 it's hard to feel just how subversive that is. So let's just imagine for a moment through the ages. Under Roman rule, for example, the emperor was treated as divine. And so when Christians would gather and proclaim Christ as King, Jesus as King, it was a statement about who was really in charge. There is a story about a second century Christian. His name was Polycarp. Polycarp was he was a disciple of John the Apostle. And he was a second century Christian. He was martyred for his faith because he would not deny Christ. And there's this way of dating things, right? You've seen this as we've read through like the Old Testament or things where you, in the ancient world, you would date it by like who was king, who was in charge of this, who was in charge of that. And so when the church fathers went to write the story of Polycarp's martyrdom, about his arrest and martyrdom, they wrote it like this, and I'm just going to quote it to you. Polycarp was apprehended by Herod when Philip of Tralles was high priest in the proconsulship of Statius Quadratus, but in the reign of the eternal King Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory, honor, greatness, and eternal throne from generation to generation. Amen. Throughout the ages, as kingdoms rose and fell, as kings and queens ascended to their thrones only to eventually be put into their graves, Christians have gathered together to proclaim Christ as the eternal King upon his throne. And every time we do so, it challenges the powers and the authorities of this world who fight and fight and fight to assert that it is really they who are in control. And to this we say, Christ is King, and a king like no other. This year, our readings, the prophet Ezekiel reminds us that our king is a shepherd. What is the life of a shepherd? Well, here, let me read to you what the Lord has spoken through Ezekiel. He says, as shepherds seek out their flocks when they are among their scattered sheep, so I will seek out my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places to which they have been scattered. I will bring them out of from all the peoples and gather them from the countries. I will bring them into their own land. I will seek the lost. I will bring back the strayed. I will bind up the injured. I will strengthen the weak. But the fat and the strong I will destroy, and I will feed them with justice. What is the life of a shepherd? To live amongst the flock, to defend them from danger, to seek them when lost and restore them, care for them, lead them to places where they can prosper. This is Christ, our King. Matthew reminds us that our King shares in our suffering. Let me read our gospel to you again, verse 37. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, thirsty and gave you something to drink? A stranger and welcomed you, naked and gave you clothing? When was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the King will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. Not for me. You didn't clothe them for me. You didn't feed them for me. You did it to me. Jesus reminds us that when it comes to the incarnation and God has been united in Jesus, man and God, that it also united God and our suffering. There is no, in the kingship of Christ, let them eat cake. God knows and understands our suffering in a deep and real understanding, a shared understanding. This is Christ, our King. This is the Christ we gather to proclaim King each week for generations. No matter where Christians have been around the world, it has not mattered if there was a king or a queen, an emperor or an emir, a chief or a czar, a shogun or a shah. We have proclaimed Christ as King wherever we are. And we do this because of the story of our gospel. About a king who went seeking after lost sheep. About a king who made himself suffer. That through the kingship of Christ, by his coming down here, Jesus' suffering, his death, his resurrection, not just so that a king could have subjects, would live in a good land, but in fact, so that, as Jesus would call it, we could become inheritors of a kingdom. This is the message that we proclaim. It's the message, whether it's Christ the King Sunday or just a regular Sunday when we gather around this table and we share in the Eucharist. We remember that it is not just a king who is benevolent, who rules over us, but a king who has made us inheritors of a kingdom, who have made us children of God. We must proclaim Christ as King. We must do so because we live as ambassadors in a world that does not know or recognize him as king. But so that they can hear that if they draw near to him, they can hear the words that Jesus says, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." This is Christ our King. Amen.